Hello, I am Ethan Dixon, and this is What It Is Like to Be a Quark, my final paper for USF PIH 4320, uh, Philosophy of the Mind class. In this video, I will read my most current draft. Any comments or criticisms are appreciated, and I will attempt to leave a copy of the paper in the description of this video as well. So without further ado, what is it like to be a quark? What is and is not conscious? This deceptively simple question has been criminally underanalyzed in the philosophical community. There are many theories about what minds are, and many more about how they work, but I have yet to hear a good argument that is able to clearly dictate which creatures are and are not capable of consciousness. Physicalists argue that only a certain sect of biological creatures are capable of forming mental states, yet offer no taxonomic bar with which we can determine where exactly creatures became capable of consciousness. They freely admit that the animals we readily empathize with are capable of higher thought, but do not engage with the more alien life forms. Dualists are no better. They spend their time arguing about how the mind interacts with the body, but I have yet to hear a serious look into why this non-physical substance interacts with us so consistently while ignoring older life forms. It would seem that we have intuitively reached the consensus that conscious creatures are only those that we can empathize with, but empathy has nothing to do with the metaphysical existence of consciousness. Whether or not we are capable of recognizing consciousness should not be of metaphysical consequence. Panpsychism is a modern, sort of informal theory of the mind, which claims that mind is a fundamental particle and that all things exhibit consciousness, inanimate or otherwise. Some theorists even claim that atoms and subatomic particles are capable of consciousness. There are many sects of those who describe this theory, such as pan-protopsychists or constitutive panpsychists, who have their own amendments on what sort of consciousness or mental powers atoms and inanimate objects command. But the key takeaway is always the same. Consciousness is fundamental to the world and not exclusive to higher biological organisms. While on the surface this may seem absurd, it has gained accreditation in recent years and has become a topic of serious philosophical study. While this may seem a little silly, it is the only answer to the question of what is and is not conscious that isn't based on our ability to empathetically identify it. So maybe it's worth a deeper look. In this paper, I argue that the principles of panpsychism and its alternate forms are fundamentally true. I am, however, proposing that instead of treating it as a theory of mind to replace previous physicalist and dualist arguments, we should instead concentrate on the truthfulness of its metaphysical claims. Panpsychism does not necessarily cause problems for dualists or physicalists, and any philosopher of the mind can and should adopt the principles of panpsychism while maintaining their previously held beliefs. In order to make a metaphysical case for the principles of panpsychism, we will first need to make a few assumptions and establish a few definitions. First, I want to establish the subtle differences in my usage of the terms mind, consciousness, mentality, and a mental state. Mental states refer to a singular instance of mental processing, which includes both biological processes of the expression of such a state, as well as any outside mental processes that may or may not exist. They can be incredibly simple or impossibly complex. Mentality just refers to a thing's ability to form a mental state of any sort. In this paper, I will operationally be drawing a line between the familiar biological component and the mysterious mental components of a mental state. To be clear, I am not a dualist, but the debate between dualism and physicalism is not of consequence to this paper, and it is much easier to prove that by using a dualistic approach to the description of mentality. So, on to some assumptions. The first and largest assumption I'm going to make is that mental processes, that is the mental component of a mental state and or consciousness, is reducible. What exactly does it mean for something to be reducible? It means only that it can be divided into parts. The mental component of any given mental state, such as the experience of joy, can be broken down into some kind of mental unit. The experience of joy is a construction of some assortment of mental stuffs. What that something is not of consequence, because all that matters to me is that you agree that the operation of describing consciousness as a formation of individual mental units is possible. For the operational purposes of this paper, I'm going to make up a word for this unit of mental stuff. Thus, I am presenting to you, for your amusement and reading ease, the quink. A quink is the fundamental unit of consciousness, the smallest possible unit of mental substance that we can consider to contain any sort of mental power, or the thing that comes together to construct instances of consciousness. You could debate me on this point and say that the conscious experience of pain cannot be described as a construct of quinks, but I think that is a mistake. If you say that consciousness is irreducible, then you must also conclude there is no way to compare minds or their mental states without them being identical. This is because, without consciousness being a construction of quinks, then distinct conscious experiences, or the mental components of a mental state, are metaphysically separate entities. And if they are separate entities, like in the same way that matter is separate from non-physical substances, then an individual mental state cannot be used to relate to any other mental state. This seems intuitively false to me. I can compare the feelings of fear and excitement by the feeling of restlessness they induce in me. The love I feel for my brother and the love I feel for my goldfish are both instances of love, but they are not the same kind of love. I can be afraid of both polar bears and deadlines, and those fears can be both similar and dissimilar in different mental respects. Emotions and feelings have comparable qualities, and therefore must be discriminable, dividable, and reducible. Second, I am assuming that mental processes are to some degree linked with biological processes. The nature of this relationship is again not of consequence, but it appears to me that there is some interaction or mirroring or continuity between states of consciousness and our biological structure. When we experience pain, we exhibit a pattern of brain activity. When we imagine objects, our brain exhibits an associated brain state. This is an ironclad relationship and not subject to change. Whether this is due to the mind being identical to the brain, the consciousness being the computational construct of the brain, or a loose relationship between consciousness and the brain matters not. The third and final assumption I'm going to make is the safest one. Biological mechanisms can be completely described by the laws of physics and chemistry. Biology is a physical discipline and is thusly completely describable through physical means. There should be no disagreements there. With these assumptions and definitions put forward, we can begin the argument. In order to establish what is and is not capable of consciousness, we must first find the location of the fundamental unit of consciousness. If consciousness is reducible, then it must be able to be reduced into something. By the nature of being reducible, the mind and or its mental states must be partly made of mental parts or quinks. This is true of every accredited theory of the mind. If you were a dualist or epiphenomenalist, then quinks would be the individual units of non-physical substance. If you are a mind-brain identity theorist, then quinks are brain parts. If you are a functionalist, then quinks are the smallest possible unit of computation or information transfer. Even the behaviorist definition of a mental state can be broken down into quinks that make up the smallest unit of behavior. With this accepted as true, I have a question for you. We know it to be true that biology is somehow related to the mind, and we know by nature of the fact that biology is a physical discipline that it is reducible in the same metaphysical way as the mind. So is it not true that they can be reduced together? It doesn't seem like a huge leap in logic to assume that if one had a smaller, less complex biology, that one would be capable of fewer mental states. Let's take a human brain and a singular neuron, for example. The brain's neural states correspond with consciousness to some degree, and the brain's complicated and complex inner workings allow for it to reflect the large breadth of emotions and imaginative abilities that we enjoy. But a single neuron is not so capable. It cannot create the elaborate framework that associates with our experience of love or companionship because it lacks the necessary biological foundation. The simpler the biological process, the simpler the corresponding or reflected mental process. Note that I use the term simpler here not to be belittling or to establish some sort of mental hierarchy among things, because that would be silly, but just to point out that as you reduce the brain, you lose the ability to reflect certain conscious states. If we can fully reduce the biological components of the human brain into its fundamental parts, then we should be able to identify the location of the quink. And with this known, we can finally answer our question about what is and is not capable of mentality. So now, let us engage in some reductions. Let us examine the human experience of pain and reduce it to its fundamental physical parts so that we may identify the location of the fundamental unit of consciousness. Note that when I use the term location, I do not mean spatially, but rather an associative location. It is equivalent to me saying that my experience of the color red is at the location of the apple sitting in front of me, because my experience of redness is tied to the apple's existence, rather than meaning that my perception of redness occupies a space on the apple, because that would be incoherent. Because I just drew a line between the experience of redness and the electromagnetic wave of radiation that we call red. Anywho, when humans experience pain, there is an associated brain state or set of brain states. Brain states are constructs of neural activity. We know this to be fact. As someone experiences pain, there is an observable increase in electrical activity in certain regions of the brain, and it is common for further activation of other regions of the brain which correspond to the pain sensation. So one could say that perhaps a singular neuron is the location of this quink that we have been looking for. But hold on. Before we conclude this, we have to ask ourselves what a neuron actually does on a biological level. What do neurons do to create the biological component of a mental state, which then causes further biological action? It, in and of itself, does not. The electrical discharge caused by the movement of ions in a neural cell is just a method of transporting and or releasing chemical messengers, such as neurotransmitters, around the brain and or hormones into the bloodstream. These chemical messengers are the real carriers of information throughout the body, and therefore the real physical components of a mental state. Neurons are simply regulatory tools. So then, one could say that perhaps these specific chemical messengers are the location of the quink. It must be the right assortment of these special chemical messengers that can construct the biological complex that is capable of exhibiting a relationship with consciousness. But hold on once more. For then we have to ask ourselves what it is that these chemical messengers do once they arrive at their destination that associates them with the construction of the biological components of a mental state. What is special about these specific chemicals that gives them this power? These chemicals bind to receptor proteins to cause a corresponding cell signaling cascade, which is a succession of other chemical interactions that will all add up to create or trigger a chemical cellular response. So you see, limiting mentality to a few chemical species is an incomplete conclusion, because we have a huge number of chemical messengers in the body that we use on a regular basis. Without each individual chemical step in the activation of a neuron or in the neural hormonal signal reception by the body, the experience of pain would be incomplete. The chemical messengers that are directly released by the brain are no more important than those released by proteins in the cell for transfer of information. You must account for all of the body's chemical messaging systems in the construction of the biological system that has a relationship to consciousness. So once again, one could say, fine, the fundamental unit of consciousness is located within all chemical messengers. It seems that this chain of communication is what comes together to create the biological system that partly forms the mental states we experience. But hold on there. We cannot let this sit without first determining that this location cannot be further reduced. What makes a chemical into a chemical messenger? How can they be physically distinguished from any other chemical? What is it about their interactions that allows them to come together to create the biological component of the mental state of pain? Each of these individual chemical reactions are dictated by energetic laws. Polar charges attract the opposite charge, and hydrophobic and/or nonpolar segments of chemicals and proteins come together because it is entropically favorable to do so when dissolved in polar solvents, like water. In high-energy conformations, chemicals are unstable, and their existence is therefore unfavorable. So they are drawn together because they are more stable when they are together than when they are not. This energetic relationship is dictated by the atoms which make up the chemical messengers and its receptor, or more accurately, the relationship between subatomic particles such as the proton, neutron, and electron. We can go one more level deep and say that it is the number of up and down quarks that dictate the properties of protons and neutrons, which interact with the electrons, which all comes together in a special pattern of succession to create the brain state that is associated to the conscious experience of pain. The point is, there is no physical difference between chemical messengers and non-messaging chemicals because they operate in exactly the same manner and accomplish identical subatomic tasks, just within different contextual situations. So finally, one must say that the true location of the fundamental unit of consciousness is found with the fundamental units of matter. These fundamental units of matter, when arranged in the proper way, can come together to create a pattern which is associated with the arrangement of quinks, which then creates the human experience of pain. We have now established that mental states can be constructed from the fundamental unit of consciousness and fundamental unit of matter, which are linked together. With this newly acquired understanding of the location of the fundamental unit of consciousness, we can then approach the question of what is and is not capable of mentality. We know that in order to be capable of forming the mental component of the mental state of any kind, you need an arrangement of quinks. We also know that the formation of said arrangement can be observed through the correlated fundamental physical units. However, all things physical are made up of the fundamental units of matter. The human brain is simply a complex arrangement of atoms, just like every other physical object. So if the body can be tethered to mentality, how can we say that anything doesn't have an associated mental state? In fact, the above line of reasoning forces us to say that all things, inanimate or otherwise, are capable of primitive, or maybe a better word would be inflexible, mentality. Every subatomic constructs, like protons, have quinks, and therefore even every atomic construct has a mental state. I have constructed a logical platform below to formally describe how we can prove that all things exhibit mentality. There are a few important points to note about this conclusion. For one, when I say that all things are capable of mentality, I am not making the claim that inanimate objects are capable of biological emotions such as pain. Things like joy and pain are experiences that can only be attributed to complex life forms, because it involves a very complicated arrangement of quinks and a uniquely biological facilitation. You could maybe make the case that quinks enable inanimate objects to have unique conscious experiences such as pain if you have a looser definition of a mental state, but I am not attempting to make such a claim. I am only claiming that there is nothing unique to biological makeup that enables it and it alone to be capable of mental processes. Biological systems are in a physical sense indistinguishable from any other chemical system, and therefore cannot hold any special mental status over other physical things. To clarify, the mental state of a rock, assuming we could even comprehend it, would share almost no qualities with the complex mental state of a biological organism, because they have vastly different structures, built with different structures, but still made of quinks. And all you need to say, all you need to have for a mental state is a construction of quinks. With this understanding, we are able to say that all things at all levels exhibit mentality and could be considered conscious, which finally gives us a metaphysical way of determining consciousness without relying on our ability to recognize it. While the theory of panpsychism was proposed as a novel theory of the mind, I would encourage you to think otherwise. The principles of panpsychism can be proven to be absolutely true, but it doesn't tell us nearly as much about the mind as you might have hoped. At first glance, this would appear to cause a lot of issues for previous theories of the mind, but this is not so. While this is an absolute metaphysical truth, it doesn't answer nearly as many questions about the mind or consciousness. In fact, it only makes things more difficult. Take the mind-body interaction problem, for example. If we are to equip our dualistic lenses, it is evident that the mind and body are tied together, but the idea that this continues to an atomic level doesn't solve the issue of their method of interaction. It just moves the focus from macro to micro to nano and now to pico. So the debate between dualism and physicalism just enters the next stage. There are a few additions to the debate surrounding qualia, but it only seems to muddy the waters further. The biggest issue with the theory of panpsychism is the combination problem, or the idea that we still don't understand how the quinks come together to form the mental states that we know, or how they can generate qualia. This isn't a new problem. It's a very traditional method of poking holes in physicalist arguments. And it is absolutely true that even after identifying the location of the quink, we are no closer to understanding the experience of consciousness or qualia. But because we can arrive at the principles of panpsychism without being strictly physical, this now becomes a problem for dualists as well. Because we have found the location of quinks and determined that all things have mentality, they now have to ask if qualia are unique to higher organisms or fundamental to all things. They are forced into the debate between the different sects of panpsychism, who argue about what the mental experience is like for inanimate objects, or what mental processes objects are capable of. And they are no longer able to simply say that qualia are non-physical without any sort of further analysis. They must hold either that quinks inherently have qualia, and that there is something it is like to be a quark, or that quinks come together to form qualia. You could soundly argue for both conclusions, but you have to choose one position or the other. One other issue is that now that we have done away with the bar for mentality, how do we limit any one mind? It is true that some kind of mental state is associated with every conformation of matter. If this is true, then where do we draw the line between your mind and mine? With the conclusion of this paper to be accepted, if I stubbed my toe, I could consider the contact between the wall and my toe to be a part of the resulting pain mental state. The wall could be described as a part of my mind because the chemical interactions I have with the wall are physically indiscriminable from the chemical interactions that make up the brain relationship with my mental state. This is both a very cool and extremely upsetting proposition. It is easy to accept that my environment has an effect on my mental state, but it is not so easy to say that my environment is a part of my mental state. It's also my intuitive belief that we are products of our environment, and this view would allow us to describe feelings in terms of their relationship to the world. But this is a Pandora's box kind of concept as well, because it paves the way for some extremely radical arguments. Without any bounds of mentality, what's to stop someone from describing a company as conscious, or the entire planet as a singular consciousness? Maybe there is value or even a degree of truth in those arguments, but it is my intuitive belief that there is a line between my mind and yours that I cannot cross. I would argue in response to this that the difference between the mental state of my brain and the mental state of another is a matter of communication. We can define separate entities in the material world based on their interactions with one another or separation in space. Like, for example, I am a distinct object because the air particles that my skin contacts behave in a way that can be categorized as not my body. So why not do the same for the mind? My brain and yours are not the same simply because we are not connected in a directly physically meaningful way. The atomic particles that make up my brain are not significantly affected by the ones that make up yours because we are not neurally collected. This does still open us up to some very radical arguments about our minds, but defining our minds as separate in the same way that we can define objects as separate seems like a workable solution. So maybe panpsychism isn't as crazy as we initially thought. Maybe it isn't as extreme as it first appears. And maybe it doesn't completely change our modern philosophical and physical understanding of the mind. Maybe it's worth consideration.